Hello, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications for PFLAG National. It's great to have you with us for another episode of our show. As always, I am joined by my good friend and colleague, our Director of Learning and Inclusion, Jean Marie Nevada.
Liz Owen.
Jean Marie Nevada, how are you this fine day?
It's kind of been a week. And I feel like sometimes we pick show topics and I don't even realize how much I need to have a conversation about them. And honestly, I could not possibly have thought about something I needed more to talk about than self-care than I do right now.
I know we've been talking about it a lot over these last several years, but yeah, I feel like it's never an irrelevant topic.
Yeah, just feeling super relevant right now. So I am really great that the program gods all lined up or goddesses lined up to make this happen. So I will see you later, Liz Owen. But thank you so much.
Have a really good conversation.
Thanks, Liz. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she and her, or ella if you use Spanish. And I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. Every single week, we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week is no difference from that. So this week, as I kind of teased, we are talking about self-care, which is one of my very favorite topics. And it has become even more interesting to me over the past few years because it's become such a mainstream conversation, but maybe not the conversation we needed. So for those of you who are following online and who like to read our article for the week and who want some discussion questions, you can definitely download those at straightforequality.org/discussion series. So this week's article comes from Women's Health. And the title of the article I kind of love is Everything You Know About Self-Care Isn't Wrong, but It's Not Quite Right. And so essentially the article goes into how the treat yourself approach that a lot of us have kind of learned via the media isn't necessarily bad, but it's actually kind of incomplete. And we really need to understand what self-care needs besides meeting our immediate impulses for things like manicures, which, by the way, I always have an impulse for. And today, to have the conversation, we have a great guest with you. So let me tell you about our guest before we bring him in. So Rahim Thawer is a psychotherapist, a clinical supervisor, a facilitator, a public speaker, a sessional lecturer, writer, and community organizer. So I'm pretty sure he's never slept in his entire life. He's dedicated almost 10 years to organizing in his community, including with Salam Canada, which is a national volunteer-run LGBTQ Muslim organization. He's also a co-editor and essay contributor in the book Any Other Way, How Toronto Got Queer, which, by the way, was shortlisted for a 2017 Toronto Book Award and is currently working on a new book. We had a few minutes to talk before the show, and I am so excited to introduce you to Rahim Thawer.
Hello, Jean Marie. Thanks for having me.
Hello, Rahim. I am so happy that you are here today. As I was saying to Liz, this just feels like a super necessary conversation, and you've been so soothing already. So I think we're going to have fun.
That's good. Great. Let's do it.
So first, I just want to start here. We hear this word self-care all the time. I feel like, especially the last 2 years, everyone's talking about it. What is it? Because it does need to be more than just mani-pedis and doing like a nice face mask or something like that. How do you see it?
Yes. Look, I think there's a bit of a difference between self-care and an activity that is soothing or self-soothing, right? So I could say I'm going out for steak today because I've had a hard day, or I'm having a glass of wine. That overlaps self-care and self-soothing, but I think self-care is more of a practice, right? So when you talk about mani-pedis, to me, that sounds like soothing. You have an impulse, you do something that feels fun, and it meets a need. So there's nothing wrong with it, but it might not be a sustainable practice. Whereas like good sleep hygiene, exercise, food, time with friends, having boundaries or parameters around your work, those could be things you're doing for self-care. So that's kind of how I think about self-care, things that are a practice.
I love that distinction because I think it actually puts some parameters around it for me, and it makes me start drawing those lines. I love the fact that you just said putting boundaries around work and just creating boundaries. I know that this week's article actually talked about it. Before I get into anything else, can we talk about that a little bit more? Can you explain why that is so important and why that is a self-care practice? Because I think that it might be something a lot of people miss, myself included.
Yes, look, first of all, self care is hard to practice because we often feel guilty when we're not pushing ourselves hard enough. Sometimes we sit around and we say, "Oh, I did nothing today." And I think we could reframe that to say, I was taking care of myself today, right? If you're watching TV and it's hard to pay attention and you're on your phone and you're barely paying attention to that, some people are like, I'm being driven bananas by technology and I need a break from all of it. Maybe it could also be like a unique way that you take care of yourself, right? You have found a way to get caught up in multiple things without being necessarily productive. That sounds like self-care to me, you know? Channeling energy into something that's soothing, reparative, that's all self-care. I also think that when we feel like we've done nothing, we strongly need to reframe that. So, you know, I think if you're just sitting around or you're laying in bed in the morning and you're thinking about your family, people you care about, maybe you're reflecting on nice memories, you're looking at the sky and looking at things outside. All of that is self care, and all of that is something. We have to take this idea away that we're doing nothing or that doing nothing is bad, because nothing is more than what we think it is, and
Yes.
it's valid.
I love that you say it because I think about how many times somebody will say to me, especially on a weekend, so what did you do today? And I'll be like, oh, I actually didn't get a lot done. I sat around, I read, I did this, I swam. And I think, boy, I was lazy today. And as you're saying this, I'm thinking that actually is self-care. So thank you. I actually needed that. So one of the things that I found interesting in the article was that it noted that in one study, 42% of adults actually said that in the last 2 years, they have relied on very unhealthy habits. And the article specifically mentions things like drinking too much to actually
Mm.
get by. And yet at the same time, I think we could probably agree in the last 2 years, too, we have also heard more conversation about self-care. So where did this go off the rails? Because it seems like people have
Yeah.
really misunderstood it and not intentionally at all.
Yeah, look, I think uh it's a challenging time because what somebody considers self-care could feel almost offensive to somebody else. So if you're talking about needing a break from your everyday routine, that's totally valid. But it's also possible that your everyday routine looks on the outside to be a lot more cushioned and comforting than somebody else's every day, right?
Mhm.
So I think we have to think about how we can let go, relax, rest, and take care of ourselves on an individual basis, but also be conscientious that we can't push our self-care agenda on somebody else because some people they're hustling. They need to work multiple jobs, they're grieving the loss of many people in their lives over
Yeah.
the last 2 years. To tell them to just, chill out would be kind of inappropriate. So I think we have to think about that a little bit. The other piece is that, you know, more and more we're talking about what self care looks like in workplaces.
Yeah.
And that's challenging because we're coming out of a pandemic. We're seeing that capitalism doesn't really work or serve most people. And people will say, "What do you mean by that? You're anti capitalist." I'll say, "No, no, look, I love to buy things, I love to participate in capitalism. It's just not like a great system."
For
Right?
everyone.
Because yeah, like to be able to do that, like other people get exploited. And I only do that because I think I'm filling some void inside me, right? Like we're part of a system that's constantly exhausting. And when you try to talk about grind culture, like the everyday hustle, and you try to squeeze self care in there, it's kind of annoying because big companies are essentially co opting language around how to take care of yourself in a way that entices people to work harder or produce more results, which
Yeah.
is kind of obnoxious, right? In the last how many 30, 50 years, and everybody who's listening in their lifetime, they have experienced technology make their lives way more productive. And so if your life has gotten more productive, why are you working harder? Like, we should be
Yeah.
able to work less. But
Yeah.
that's not the case. So something's amiss here.
Yeah. It definitely feels like sort of an off track thing. I want to sort of shift the conversation to
Mhm.
specifically self-care in queer communities. So
Mm.
we certainly feel, I mean, certainly here in the US, but I mean, I think in a lot of places we are seeing this very much under attack. And I don't think it's just a feeling, it is very real. There is a lot of negative stuff happening
Mm.
around us. And anytime we talk about self-care, of course, my head immediately goes to Audre Lorde, who,
Mhm.
is really credited with sort of getting this conversation started. And she talked about self-care as actually an act of political warfare and self-preservation, which I love. And I try to remind myself about it. And yet I feel like sometimes we, especially in queer spaces, those of us who are doing this work, we have this guilt. It feels really self-indulgent. Can you talk a little bit
Mm.
more about sort of how Audre Lorde talked about this? And do you agree with her statement that it actually does need to be part of our political strategies?
Yes, absolutely. So I of course I agree. But what it looks like in our own lives is something we have to kind of reckon with. We have to figure out where it fits in. I do think that rest is political because when you are intentionally resting and you know that you shouldn't feel guilty for resting, and you decide to reorient your life to not make it all about outcomes and outputs, that's political because you're resisting a system of capitalism that tells you otherwise, right? And so when you're resisting that, you're also telling yourself that I'm an okay human, I'm valuable, I'm valid, even if I'm not doing a million things. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic in the last 2 to 3 years, I think people have had to reckon with those internalized messages around what their bodies are meant to do, right? I think many people thought their bodies were meant to work, to be under pressure, to produce results, to generate income. And, some of us were forced to rest, others of us um, were able to continue working in um, with a bit more ease. And I think a lot of people learned about the utility of going at a slower pace. And so when I think about resting as being political or self care as being political, I also think that means that, um, you know, we may need to invest more time in like community self-care practices or sorry community care practices and self-care practices, right? What time do we give to be with other people and be present when we're with them, and what time do we give to ourselves to be present with ourselves, right? And that, I think, sleeping and commuting doesn't always count. So um yeah, of course I agree that self-care is a form of resistance and it's political, but I think it's tricky for us to take a moment and think about what that looks like and means in our lives because we have to unlearn a lot of things to get there, and that's a process.
It's, as you're speaking, I'm sitting here and I'm really listening and I'm thinking, this is such a message. I don't think we can say it enough because I'm even thinking a couple of weeks ago, when the Dobbs decision came down here, everyone's
Mhm.
upset. My first reaction was I actually need some time to process this, but then my immediate reaction was I need to go volunteer someplace else and go help out now. And it was this immediate gut reaction that we all need to leapfrog the care that we need to take care of ourselves and we need to go to work. And in some cases that
Yeah.
backfires. So one of the things that I've been thinking about as you've been talking and as I've been reading more about self-care is, a lot of us do have resistance to it. We have this idea that we do need to go out there and work harder and work harder and work harder. Do you think some of the resistance to the idea of even doing self-care is actually also tied to our persistent stigma around mental health issues? That we are still fundamentally uncomfortable with talking about them, even in good progressive spaces, and that makes
Mhm.
the idea of saying I need to step back more difficult.
So I actually think that it's not necessarily connected to stigma around mental health, but I think it's connected to not just a capitalist, but an ableist culture. So I think
Mm.
we have this idea about what it means to be functional and quote unquote contributing members of society. And we take those ideas to the bank. We're like, if I'm not doing all of these things, what am I really worth?
Yeah.
And so the idea to take time means that you either have excess time, or you are saying no to money, or you're being indulgent. It has all of these connotations, and a lot of us just aren't there yet. And to be frank, you know, we can't stop altogether, right? This is why I say we have to figure out what self care means individually. Like Toni Morrison has this beautiful quote that I always think about, and she said, "I get angry about things and then go on and work." And what I love about that is, we need space to grieve and be in rage, and we have to recognize that if you're engaging in some kind of political action, that could be healing and therapeutic. If you're at a protest, that could be very important, therapeutic and healing. It can also be exhausting, right? And so you kind of got to figure out what self care is going to look like for you. It could mean that I engage in community, and it also means that I take time for myself, right? it would be it would be unfortunate if somebody used the veil of self-care to um, to mask their apathy around some of the things going on in the queer community, right? So you don't have to take everything on, but I do think it's a good idea to know what the heck is going on, right? So I say that to a lot of my brothers that are cis gay men, because we're not under attack in the same way that our trans siblings are, and I know it's a lot in the news cycle, but I think we do need to know about it.
Agree. 1,000 could not possibly
Yeah.
agree with you more. So especially for people in queer and some of our ally spaces, where would you suggest someone gets started with their self-care efforts, especially if their resources are limited? Because we know that in our community, a lot of us are working in very limited situations. A lot of people are working in jobs in which they are barely making enough money to live on, if they're making enough money to live on it as we start right there.
Yes.
What would you say? Because I do sometimes feel like there is kind of a little bit of elitism to the even concept of self-care. Where do you coach people to begin?
Okay. I usually I do a simple diagram with people. So you draw a circle, and then you have 5 arrows that are going out of the circle, and you label those. Those are things you do that take energy out of you. It's not about whether you like them or not. They take energy out of you. And then in between them, you draw 5 arrows going into the circle, and you have to identify things that re-energize you. It's not about what you like to do and don't like to do. It's not about joy. It's about refueling. And that I think is important because people can figure out what that looks like for them. You know, I've worked with a lot of people that are underhoused, and yeah, they're struggling a lot. But with a simple exercise like that, they might say, "Oh, you know what? There's a community center, and I like to go there and use the computers for a while." And is it fun? Not necessarily, but does the arrow go inward? Does it refuel you? And they'll be like, "Yeah, I get out of the cold. The people there are nice. Sometimes there's free snacks." That's a good activity then. So I think we have to identify what refuels us, and I think anyone can do an exercise like that. Self-care is, like I said, it's a practice, and it also requires some self-awareness. So you're gonna have some trial and error. It's really not about green juice and yoga, though it can be, but that's not the only thing, right? And to be fair, like people who do um, a lot of extracurricular activities or eat fancy foods, like that's great. They should continue doing that. But for a lot of people, they find that exhausting and oppressive too. So you kind of have to figure out, like, is it refueling you, or is it making you feel like a failure if you don't do it?
I cannot even begin to tell you how much I love the idea of that model. And in my head, I'm of course drawing the circle and thinking about what my arrows are. Thank you. That is, I have to tell you, I spent so much time preparing for this show and reading, and I don't think I found anything that was as useful as what you just shared. So I am so grateful to you at this moment. I actually am kind of stuttering over my words. So I do want to spend a couple of minutes talking about Salam Canada, because I was so fascinated when I was reading your bio, because there is so much good work happening in Muslim spaces. Can you tell us a little bit about what it does, how it started, what programs are happening, and if people want to connect, how they can do it? Because this really excited me. And I know this wasn't the focus
Yeah.
of the conversation, but if I have you,
Yes. No, totally. And Salam Canada is has generated spaces for community care, which is related to our topic, right? So, as an LGBTQ Muslim national organization that's volunteer run, it began and was founded in 1990. Um, and it had chapters in Vancouver, Toronto. For a short period, it had a chapter in Halifax. At present, as a national structure, it's kind of undergoing some changes, but the bulk, the one of the big services or the big programs we had was an ongoing discussion. And during the pandemic, it became a discussion support space that went virtual and was national. And we also had people from the US join us. So that's kind of fabulous. We developed a discussion guide. So if people go to salamcanada.info, SALAAM Canada.info, go to the resources section under publications. There's a discussion guide, and LGBTQ Muslims can use that discussion guide to generate peer support groups wherever they are. And people of other faith groups may find it useful as well. So I dedicated over 10 years to that organization. And I was part of the national core team. And more recently, I've taken a step back and we've decided that the regional groups, so in Edmonton, in Toronto, in Ottawa, they're kind of doing their own thing, and they're doing great, like Eid and social and other like therapeutic support programming. But we've also seen, the reason I've taken a step back is because we've seen such an influx of smaller groups organizing, and that's a beautiful thing. So anyone that's on Twitter or Instagram, if you just use the hashtag queer Muslims or LGBTQ Muslims, there's so many people sharing beautiful, beautiful stories about themselves, their lives, and their bravery. And I think social media has become its own intervention tool. So, there's less of a need for a structured national organization in our context, but more so smaller, tidbits from social media and regional groups that are running this show now. And so, like, I'm thrilled to make way for that. And we have that website that's got heaps of resources on it.
I love that. Can you tell me, are you starting to see more people opting in? It sounds like because of social, we are seeing that. And are you seeing any sort of progress with families? Because I think, one of the things that we see in a lot of our circles is, it's the people who are LGBTQ come out first, and then we sort of see the wave of family members that come after that. Are you seeing anything happening in that space?
Yes, absolutely. People are sharing more and more on social media about what their experience is like coming out to their families. And the responses are all over the map. So you get negative responses, but you also get people who share stories, of like surprisingly good responses. And so that's really nice to hear. There's a group in the States called Desi Rainbow Parents and Allies.
Yes.
And you know them, of course.
Yes.
And I've been doing some peer support training work with those volunteers, and some of them are parents, and they're like fantastic humans. And so I have a lot of hope, and I think there's a lot of resilience in our communities. I try to balance, and I think we all need to balance this idea that people of faith might be homophobic or transphobic, like that's possible. But we also need to create space, to appreciate how resilient they can be and how accepting they might be, because a lot of the times they are. And sometimes they're not initially, and they need support to get to the place we want them to be. And I think they're often just bombarded with a lot of rhetoric about them being backwards, and that kind of Islamophobia sets them back instead of giving them a supportive bridge,
Yeah.
But the work is happening, and I think that's bigger than me, that's bigger than you, that's just the world is turning and that work is happening. So that's really nice.
It really is. Desi Rainbow is amazing. We work with Aruna a lot, and she has
Yeah.
just been such an absolute rock star. And I love your point. I think there's just so much to be said for there is the assumption that certain people of faith are not going to be accepting. And I certainly think people who are Muslims certainly fall into that. As somebody who grew up Catholic, I know that there are a lot of assumptions there.
Yes.
And sometimes we find our greatest allies are actually people of faith who talk about their religion as the reason why they are inclusive.
Absolutely. Just to add to that, there's lots of LGBTQ people who have been harmed by religion, institutionalized religion, religious leaders, religious political leaders, and that harm and trauma is real and valid. But we also just need
Yes.
space for people who are within, religious communities or faith-based communities who want to keep that part of their identity with them, and they need to do their soul searching, their support seeking in that framework. Right? We just need space for all of the things.
I think that's so important. I think that some of the best experiences that I actually had sort of during my coming out actually were where there were spaces to talk about these things and not be told, oh, you need to go find a new religion. That this isn't, you need to go do something else. And I think it's so, so good, especially when you also see, we were talking to somebody last week who always kept using the phrase possibility models. When you see these possibility models for change, families who are accepting, faith communities who are accepting, allies who are accepting, and also to have LGBTQ people around you who are also respectful of religious beliefs, which is not always a given. And I think that's part of the tough conversation we have to have.
Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes people see people of faith as kind of anti-intellectual in a way, and it's just not a fair place to cast such a huge group of people, because faith brings resources to people, right? Emotional, spiritual resources to people, and it's like a big contributor to their resilience. So I think we just need to create some space for it and be respectful of it. And when we don't create space for it, it's a different kind of like ethnocentrism that we really need to challenge. Right? Like we're so proud of ourselves in North America of saying, oh, diversity this and diversity that, but like what about diversity of thought? We're not just talking about, like we have to allow for that. Like that's part of it. So it's still a work in progress in North America, where we think we have it sorted out, but we don't really.
We don't. We definitely don't. I think we just need to look, even if you look what happens here in the US, we definitely do not. So we only have a couple of minutes left. So I just want to make sure you have a chance to let people know exactly how to find you, exactly how to stay in contact and to follow your work. And if there's anything coming up you want to let people know about, please do.
Sure. Look, if you go to Lady Ativan, ATIVAN.com, it's on the bottom of your screen. That'll take you to my all my links, and you can follow me from there. If you want to check out my video podcast on YouTube, if you want to get the audio version of my podcast, which is it's called the CBT Dive. I self-publish a bunch of writing on shame, envy, LGBTQ Muslims on my Medium account. You can just catch me and get connected to me in all the ways just by going to ladyativan.com. I don't have any talks coming up per se, but I do have a book coming out by Thorntree Press. It's called Seeking: Stories of a Gay Therapist Making Sense of Connection and Relationships. I don't know when it's coming out, but I imagine in 2023 because my manuscript is due by the end of this year. So I'm looking forward to that.
So you're living against your deadline like the rest of us.
Yes, I very much am.
Well, I can promise you I'm going to be reading it because I think it just sounds really fascinating. And I would be so interested to see sort of what you've learned with the lens that you have. Rahim, thank you so much. I cannot even begin to tell you how perfectly timed this conversation was. I mean, we are watching sort of National Self-Care Day happening. Or International Self-Care Day rather, but you absolutely have added so much to this conversation and I think really helped a lot of us reframe it. So thank you. And I hope that when the book is out, you're going to come back and be able to talk to us even more.
Yes, I would love to do that. And that will motivate me to get writing. So thanks for having me.
You already have a fan base, just so you know, right here. So thank you. Thank you. We will see you soon. Well, everybody, that gets us to the end of another show. That was a fantastic one. I think I'm going to sit here and actually do my circle and my arrows and see where I get started. And I hope that you're doing something like that too. Be kind to yourself as well as to other people. So we wrap up the exact same way every single week by first of all reminding if you need help, visit us at pflag.org/find to locate your closest chapter. Also a reminder that our Read with Love program continues in full force. And if you would like to learn more about that, you can learn more at pflag.org/readwithlove. It's a great way to make yourself feel good about doing something good for the universe. Every single week, we do wrap up with the exact same advice. And if you are wondering, it does in fact come from Doctor Who. So what you need to do is run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, please be kind. We'll be back next week with another fantastic show. Please take care of yourselves, be good to yourselves, and I'll see you next week.